doctoral student at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He's a research assistant in Nutrition and Exercise Performance Research Group. He's studying under Dr. Nicholas Berg, and he's looking and conducting scientific research, investigating the effects of nutrition and exercise on skeletal muscle health. He received his Bachelor of Science in Exercise and Sports Science from University of Wisconsin and Master of Science in Exercise Physiology from Texas Christian University. Beyond the laboratory, Andy has competed successfully in the sport of powerlifting and has set several national and international records and has won 2 world championships. So Andy comes with not only academic experience and expertise, but actually real life experience. And what we're going to do, George, is Andy's got a brief PowerPoint that he wants to share. And then there'll be, the bulk of it will be questions and answers. And so I guess, Andy, what I would ask is that people hold their questions until, unless you want otherwise, until your brief PowerPoint is over. Is that how you like to do it, or?
I don't mind if people jump in. So to give a little bit of background, before everyone got in, we were all chatting about this. I wasn't sure the best way to go about kind of presenting this information. Mainly just the issue is there's a lot of technical physiology knowledge that could be needed to understand some of the more in-depth.
Oops. Sorry, Andy, I just muted you. Unmute yourself, please. Andy.
Yep.
Thank you, sorry.
Where did I get muted?
Right, just a minute ago.
Okay.
30 seconds.
So what I was worried about is some of the technical knowledge might muddy the waters a little bit. And what I wanted this to be was kind of beneficial for all of you. So what I tried to do was make a short PowerPoint just to kind of provoke conversation more so than to delineate the information itself. So I don't mind if people jump in with questions in the middle, if that's agreeable to you, Betty.
That's fine. Yeah, we've had 2 more people join us. Good morning, Barry and Lionel. Please welcome. I was just introducing Andy Askow, who you can see up in the screen. And Andy was just talking about kind of the format, which will be a short PowerPoint. If you've got questions, Andy says he doesn't mind you jumping in with a question. And then there'll be Q's and A's toward the end. What I was just trying to do was mute everybody so we didn't have background. And of course, I muted Andy in the midst of that. So if everyone except for Andy would please mute themselves, I'm going to do the same so that we don't have background noise and we can hear Andy. And then anybody who's got questions, comments, whatever you would like to add to the conversation or ask, if you could unmute yourself, and then we'll go forward. I'm going to try and keep myself out of the middle of it. You may see extra faces coming on the screen as other people may decide to join us. So with that, Andy, it's all yours.
Awesome. Let me share my screen here. So for those of you who missed it, my name is Andy Askow. I'm a PhD student at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in the Department of Kinesiology and Community Health. And I do academic research within the Nutrition and Exercise Performance Research Laboratory. And like I said, this PowerPoint I intentionally left as just kind of the background, because I didn't want to guide the conversation in a way that suited kind of where I think it should go. What I wanted to be able to do is to answer any questions that you guys might have and to make this as pragmatic for everyone as possible versus just kind of spewing out some information. So the background I really wanted, let me just close this so I can see my whole screen. I wanted to start with, obviously, the aging process is associated with kind of losses of muscle mass and function, which are both related but independent at the same time. And this is kind of the biggest issue we have with aging, as this loss of muscle mass and function can lead to both physical decrements, so loss of independence, frailty, as well as kind of metabolic issues. So development of diseases like diabetes, sarcopenia, all of these negative outcomes. And I'm a visual learner, so if you're not, I apologize, but I wanted to demonstrate a point here. I think there's a laser pointer option. Sorry. Laser pointer. So I wanted to just demonstrate a trend here. Basically that over the course of time, obviously we live our life, and if we remain inactive through our entire lifespan, we get this aging related decrement where health, where you can think of functional capacity, anything like that, begins to decline as we approach kind of our natural end. And one of our biggest counters to this age-related decrement is physical activity. So these are the CDC guidelines. If you're unfamiliar, you can go to their website. This is an infographic pulled directly from the CDC website. And these are at least kind of minimums you would want to hit. There certainly is an argument to be made that more physical activity would be beneficial than this, but these are good starting points. And what I wanted to demonstrate was with physical activity, we can increase the health span, which is just our kind of years that we consider to be healthy. But also, I think the more important aspect of this kind of ideology is this compressed morbidity. So we're reducing the amount of time that we're suffering from chronic diseases and kind of unable to function in our world. So you can see versus this kind of sustained lower health span, this lower functional capacity, versus this more steep drop off, which sounds a bit morbid, but it's the most ideal scenario would be to be 100% healthy our entire life, and the day we move to pass would be the only day that we had any physical decrement. So this is kind of the idea of where physical activity can come in to promote health over our life. Now in our lab, we're particularly interested in muscle strengthening activity. I'm going to use this interchangeably with resistance exercise just because it's so ingrained in my head. Obviously, resistance exercise is kind of hugely important for a number of things. So these are just some of the areas where muscle is important, and therefore resistance exercise is important. Obviously, without adequate muscle mass and function, we don't have the ability to locomote, to walk around. We lose our ability to regulate blood glucose and our lipids, so we can have some adverse metabolic events. We lose our basal metabolic rate, BMR here, which means we can put on excess body fat, and then that also predisposes us to other cardiometabolic outcomes. And this is kind of what obviously my background leads me to be most focused in, is this idea of physical performance. So I'm in a lab now that is very clinically based as far as we work with kind of subclinical populations. We work with obesity, kind of diabetic. We have some research with people who are on dialysis, but my undergraduate and my graduate studies focused on more athletes in the idea of muscular strength and power just being the amount of work over time. You can think of it as the ability to contract the muscle quickly. And what I'm trying to demonstrate here is that exercise, and then this other aspect of kind of healthy lifestyle habits, protein intake or nutrition, are very important. So I can't be completely unbiased, to be fair. As a disclaimer, obviously my background that was mentioned, I was a power lifter for a long time. But when my two kind of worlds collided, being my research here and my practical background, what we wanted to do was really kind of define what strength is. So we've heard for a long time that strength is important, but our stance on strength was that strength encompassed more than just the physical demonstration of strength. So this led us to develop kind of two papers, one that got published in the Frontiers in Nutrition Journal and one that got published in Applied Physiology, Nutrition, and Metabolism. Our group handled the idea of healthy aging, and the other group developed kind of a similar framework for early childhood and adolescence. So this is my last slide here because this is kind of the whole focus of the paper and where I wanted to open it up to questions. But what we did in this paper was develop a framework by which we proposed that physical and mental strength being kind of cognitive function, your ability to understand information, to interact with the world in a understanding way, and physical or psychological well-being. This is your afferent kind of feelings. There's this interaction between physical and mental strength. And there's also this interaction between lifestyle habits, meaning particularly exercise and nutrition, that benefit each one individually in such a way that combined, they augment both in a more beneficial way than on their own. And that leads to adaptability, but you can really use a number of adjectives here. Your ability to persevere, your ability to grow, to handle challenges, and kind of navigate the world as we age. So exercise, obviously endurance exercise is hugely important, especially have to say that given we have physicians in the room. Endurance exercise being walking, running, anything that gets your heart rate up is hugely important for longevity, so lifespan per se. But what I'm particularly interested in is the ability of resistance exercise or muscle strengthening exercise to promote functional capacity. So as we lose that muscle mass, we lose that muscle function, we lose the ability to kind of independently handle our activities of daily living. And through that, we get a compounding issue, which means we decrease activity further because it's just harder for us to do things. And then we lose more muscle, we lose more function, and eventually leads to frailty. And frailty is one of the biggest predictors of cognitive decline and decreased psychological well-being with age. So the role of resistance exercise and muscle strengthening exercise in aging is clear. What is somewhat less clear is the role of nutrition in increasing this physical strength and mental strength. So I'll upfront kind of just be open and honest and say the link between nutrition and mental strength is much less solid than that between physical strength and nutrition. So there's some kind of epidemiological or population-based studies that have demonstrated a link between eating or consuming milk products with increased mental strength during an intervention. And there are also some trying to delineate the role of certain vitamins like vitamin D in mental strength, but that link is much less clear. I think the indirect is much more solid evidence for the role of nutrition and mental strength, being that nutrition clearly plays a role in physical strength. We have meta-analyses that indicate this. Meta-analyses are just studies that pool many studies to get kind of a pooled effect. And there are several which indicate that increasing protein intake may increase physical strength. And And I think that's important because right now, the US RDA, so the assumed adequate intake, is set at around 0.8 grams per kilo per day. The WHO, the World Health Organization, recommends 0.83 grams per kilo per day. And what we've demonstrated time and time again through meta-analyses and other means is that that might not be adequate for our aging population. So the idea that protein intake protein needs might be higher for an aging population is evidenced not only through that, but in other countries like France, they recommend higher protein intakes for elderly people. And this could be due to a few different things. But one of the more interesting studies was by Dan Moore, where he demonstrated that maybe protein isn't as easily digested in older individuals, meaning they might have even a higher need for protein than kind of younger individuals who are involved in resistance exercise. So altogether, we believe that kind of lifestyle habits, which it makes sense, lifestyle habits which augment physical strength and mental strength might have this crosstalk, and there are some physiological mechanisms that are relatively understudied, and I think future research ought to kind of start to investigate some of these links. So that is where I'm going to end the PowerPoint, because again, like I said, I wanted this session to be more an opportunity for you guys to ask questions if you have them. I know Betty asked me to talk on some specifics about exercise prescription, and I think I can do that, but I would love to hear from you guys, questions you might have, selfishly, because it could inform future research for us, and then also it gives me an opportunity to actually give you guys some benefit.
Don't most Americans get too much protein?
Too much protein, no. So most people meet the RDA, but what we see is they skew their protein intake towards dinner time. So the typical American protein intake looks like 10 grams of protein about for breakfast, 30 for lunch, and 60 for dinner. And what we think, we're actually about to start a study here, hopefully to delineate whether that matters. So whether backloading that protein matters, and whether splitting it up over the course of the day in more meals, so 5 meals a day, might be more beneficial. And moreover, a lot of times people get protein from lower quality sources. So protein quality, some people think it's not a big deal. This is certainly not settled science within our realm, but we certainly think that as far as the anabolic, so the ability of a protein food to stimulate muscle growth, we certainly think that that plays a huge role.
I was going to ask, does the protein source matter? I mean, if you're a vegetarian and you don't eat meat, and you get your protein from other sources, is it just as beneficial?
So there have been quite a few studies, at least using stable isotope models, which is quite often used in our laboratory. My advisor actually has done quite a few of these studies demonstrating that animal-based protein foods typically elicit higher anabolic response, but with the caveat, this is another study we're actually about to start right now. We think that the sustainability argument is certainly one that is important. Obviously, we have some issues, and finding alternative protein sources might be kind of a big role in that as we move along in a civilization. And we think that exercise per se, being anabolic, being able to stimulate muscle growth, might be able to eliminate that difference to some extent. meaning if you consume a slightly lower quality protein, being from plant-based, that you might be able to augment its ability to stimulate muscle growth with exercise. Does that make sense? Michael, yes. Can anyone else not hear Michael? Okay, Michael, we can't hear you.
He needs to unmute.
Betty, you're on mute too.
Hey, Andy.
Michael, we can't hear you. Still can't hear. Yeah, so unmute yourself and then get closer to the mic.
Can I insert a question while he's working that?
Sure.
Andy, what can you say about balance?
So I'm glad you asked. So balance is obviously hugely important, especially for a population that is at risk for falls, especially given low bone mineral density. Balance training is likely very important, but you can get some benefit, a good amount of benefit from even just getting stronger. So one of the issues, there's some argument, it might seem kind of nuanced, but there's some argument within our field about what is the most important thing to prevent falling. So balance is obviously important, but balance refers to the ability to maintain your kind of orthostatic posture, whereas you can notice that you're falling but not have the physical capacity to catch yourself, right? So this would be where the argument comes to, is it strength? Is it power, which is kind of the ability to rapidly create force? And what we see is that power tends to be most important when we talk about kind of being able to catch yourself when you're falling. And through resistance exercise, we can increase power hugely through increasing strength. And there's some argument about whether it should be strength that we focus upon with our training, or kind of strength being higher load or power being faster repetitions. And there's a huge debate there. So my stance, and the one that we just published, is that you have to be safe about it. So progressing too soon into some sort of high load or high speed is dangerous, just as progressing in any way is dangerous if you're not prepared for it. But my take on the body of literature we have available is that heavier load, not saying one repetition maximums per se, but moderately high loading with as fast as you can move safely is probably the most effective method to augment power, which then would give you the best scenario to catch yourself if you're falling.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, Michael, let's see if we can hear you. If we can't, you could always write your question in the chat. Go ahead. So you're muted. Okay. And so do you know if you can use the chat function, go down to that little chat thing and you can ask your question, right, Andy? You can do that. All right, Michael. Okay, I'm sorry. So I just one follow-up question, Andy, to that, because it's exactly what I was interested in. You know, I tell my folks, my message has been lighter weight, more reps, more sets. So let's say you start out with 2 or 3 pounds and you're going to do 8, 10, 12 reps, 1 set, 2 set, 3 set, then go up in weight. And if the weight feels a little too light, go a little more slowly, do isometric holds. And so what I'm hearing you say is no, higher load and faster builds the power really required to help people keep their balance. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, some level. So I think again, that caveat is important, that not everybody can tolerate this type of exercise in the immediate term. But it doesn't have to necessarily be thinking like barbells on the back and doing all this kind of traditional barbell training. While that would be beneficial, I think it's all relative. So even somebody who can't easily go up the stairs, having them work on going up the stairs with proper spotting to make sure no falls. People who have trouble getting up out of a chair, working on getting up out of a chair. But at the end of the day, I think the progression should be towards a little bit higher loading and as fast as safely possible, which isn't always very fast, but it's all around. I think that would be at least what our literature suggests. That would probably be the most beneficial. And it's starting to be where even the ACSM is pointing towards a little bit, the American College of Sports Medicine, and more recent reviews. But there certainly needs to be more data generated.
I have a question if Michael has not gotten his out yet. But so for the 250 minutes or the 2.5 hours a week of exercise, is there any proportion of walking to weightlifting that is recommended by your study?
So our study focused on, there are plenty of narrative reviews, meta-analyses, and everything else, which have really focused on the role of cardiovascular exercise. And I don't want to downplay the value of cardiovascular exercise for health and longevity. But we being focused mostly on muscle health, so mainly muscle protein metabolism, we wanted to focus on or propose a framework for resistance exercise. And so we didn't really touch on anything having to do with aerobic exercise.
So just coming back, Andy, to the, kind of, imagine I'm doing a bicep curl, 3, 2, 1, 1, 2, 3, that kind of timing. How would you just change the prescription for that?
Well, I think it depends on, again, how long somebody's been training. So I think if you were going to change anything, the concentric proportion, so where your muscle shortening versus lengthening, I think could be speeded up a little bit. Basically, where this idea comes from is the early data suggested that lower load moving faster was better. But all of those studies artificially limited the cadence for these exercises. So they imposed a 2-second eccentric and a 2-second concentric, and they they kind of tagged that as traditional resistance exercise, whereas that's not really the case. And more recent studies using higher loads, but moved as they kind of say always as explosively as possible, has demonstrated that that method, the higher loading with a higher velocity, is probably the most beneficial for augmenting power output. But there's certainly, again, it's not settled 100%. That's my estimation of our available evidence.
So just because you and I and maybe some others understand concentric and eccentric, if you could just explain that in terms of up and down with a bicep curl to the other people who are listening.
Yeah, so concentric refers to when the muscle is shortening. So generally, if you think of a bicep curl, it's this portion is concentric, and then you have eccentric. It's muscle shortening and muscle lengthening.
So you're suggesting the muscle shortening would be faster, the muscle lengthening a little slower. Is that what you're saying?
I mean, ideally, you just do a controlled, typically the prescription would just be a controlled eccentric, so not any particular timing, whatever you're comfortable with.
Okay.
And then an as fast as possible concentric. But again, slowly, if you're doing a 3-3 tempo, you obviously need to work that down before you can just say move as fast as possible.
So again, the same thing might be true. I mean, what you're saying is as you're capable. So you may start with 3 pounds and go faster for, let's say, 3 sets, and then go to 4 or 5 or 6, work your way up. Is that correct?
You could, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yes, Lionel, or do you have a question, or are you just, oh, you're adjusting your light. So Mike, oh, there's Michael. Let's see if we can see what the chat is here. Let's see. Oh, okay. How much protein per day, Michael asks.
Okay, so there's, again, different estimations based on whether you take quality into account. The Stu Phillips from McMaster University, who's one of the kind of world-renowned leaders in this kind of area of research, Stuart Phillips recommends anywhere from 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilo per day for anyone who is partaking in adequate physical activity, living a physically active life. There have been estimates up to 2.2 grams per kilo per day, but those data, in my opinion, are kind of a statistical weak. They're not great data. So I would say the recommendation would be somewhere between 1.1 and 1.3 grams per kilo per day. And those data come from Luc van Loon at Maastricht University in the Netherlands and Stuart Phillips at McMaster in Hamilton, Canada.
So, okay, so Michael, you're satisfied with that answer, sounds like. And again, you know, it's interesting, Dorothy, your question about where the protein source is from, and your point, Andy, about how the elderly, or as we call ourselves, healthy agers, are not as able to absorb protein as easily. So the mix on protein source, you know, dairy products, protein, fish, meat, beef, chicken, pork, any guidance, or again, soy, you know, more plant-based, any guidance on the mix of protein source?
What do you mean by the mix? Like
Well, so
what
you're,
proportion?
yeah, so you're saying, I think you said 1.3 kilos of protein per day. Is that what you were just saying? If I wrote it down from
1.1 to 1.3 grams per kilo.
Yeah, per grams. Okay, sorry, grams per kilo. And so, yeah, the proportion of what that would look like in terms of the sources of that.
So as to the proportion of animal versus plant-based proteins, I don't really have a good input for you. I think it's a balance of sustainability and kind of whatever you prefer. I think food, while it is hugely utilitarian, I think we need to enjoy our foods. And if we're not, that's probably doing us more harm than good, with all the data suggesting that psychological well-being is so important for kind of long-term outcomes. As far as, I think another important aspect of this idea, so as long as it's a high quality protein food, there are many kind of methods people use to classify. We define it as the ability to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. The WHO uses an amino acid quality score. So basically they feed fetal pigs these protein foods and measure the digestibility of that protein at the ileum. There are plenty of high quality protein foods when kind of dictated that way, but again, I think the enjoyment factor is huge, but also kind of avoiding these supplements that are hugely on the market right now. They are high quality proteins, but we have some data suggesting that even proteins aren't just simply the sum of their parts. So we have some data suggesting that even when you take an egg versus egg whites and you make them equal amount of protein, that eggs are more able to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. And we identify these as food matrix effects. So the idea that foods might not just be simply the sum of their parts, that somehow either micronutrients or ultra trace nutrients within the food matrix might be beneficial. So as far as plant versus animal, that's kind of on your preference. But high quality protein foods like milk, like eggs, like soy, like beef, pork, that are kind of intact in their food matrix is probably your best bet.
So protein bars are not the answer.
Ideally, no. They are convenient, which is their sell, right? Is these shakes and bars are all very convenient alternatives, but they may not be the most beneficial for compared to, yeah, there you go. Michael's got some whey.
Goat whey.
I've never seen that.
22 grams of protein per serving. So it's back to the kind of mental health connection. It sounds like the connection between nutrition or good nutrition and mental health, you know, it seems to make sense, but the data don't support it perhaps the same way as physical health. But what can you say about exercise specifically in mental health?
So those data are much more concrete. And one point I want to make is I'm not saying that there is no link between nutrition and mental strength per se. I think it's more likely a measurement issue than it is the lack of an effect. By that, I mean, people are hugely individually different in their response to nutritional interventions. And then that combined with our ability to measure psychological well-being and to measure cognitive performance is relatively diffuse still at this point. The constructs just aren't as strong as measuring a physical output. Therefore, I think we just need to develop better methods in the future. As far as the role of exercise for mental strength, what we know is that both resistance exercise and cardiovascular exercise improve cognition. cognition, just kind of your typical ability to think. And they also improve psychological well-being. And one thing I found was interesting in developing this framework with my colleagues was that not only does cardiovascular exercise and resistance exercise work for cognition and well-being, but there seems to be an additive effect. So whereby the combination of the two is more effective than the individual methods themselves. And I think aside from the observed effects from an intervention, it's pretty easy to see that indirectly preventing the kind of loss of functional capacity and then the decline in the frailty, preventing those are hugely important for both aspects of mental strength.
Andy, what can you suggest for resources to look further into this?
Well, our paper's open access, and Betty should have that link, or my lovely aunt can share it with anyone who's interested. It's kind of a tough question and a hard one for scientists, because one thing I think actually my advisor and I were just talking about yesterday is there's not a great amount of resources kind of for non-scientific researchers, just being that we haven't done a great job translating a lot of this into popular materials. I wish I had a better answer for you.
Well, there's probably a lot of misinformation out there too, isn't there?
Yes, there is.
Thank you.
So just, and not everybody is in my group here, but I do use the Fullerton fitness scales, Andy, as a way to measure progress, sit to stand, bicep curl. I think there are 5 or 6 of them. Would your research support the connection between those measures and increased mental and physical strength?
So I actually just developed, my advisor actually has a similar talk to this tomorrow. And he asked me for a slide on kind of assessing physical strength and performance in this framework. And I'm trying to find it. I have the slideshow open here. And one of the things I tried to indicate was that there are obviously levels. So here, let me do this. There are obviously levels to the quality of an assessment, and this is the slide I made for him. So a lot of those fall under this kind of good category. So in a laboratory setting, we have these fancy tools that are not very portable and are very expensive to give us very precise measurements of increases in muscular strength and power, and thereby theoretically, at least in our framework, translating to better mental strength. But those aren't always accessible, nor are they always pragmatic for a healthy aging population. So yeah, I would say in the framework, you would theoretically think that things like increased grip strength, increased sit to stand, gait speed, all of these things would translate to better mental strength.
So just one more question on that. I would love to have that slide that I can share. Are they norm-based as well? In other words, Fullerton has norm bases that go up to, I tell George, no reason you can't do sit to stand. The norms go up to 90 something. So are those measures or the things that you use on the good list, do you have norms for those and particular ways to measure?
Yeah, I mean, so the only one I wouldn't be sure about is medicine ball toss. But sit to stand, obviously, stair climbing. This comes from, I forget The acronym is SPPB. I forget what exactly it stands for, but it's a functional battery that we use in research quite a bit for aging populations to assess performance, where things like a 1 repetition maximum or kind of really heavy repetition maximum tests aren't feasible. Yeah, there are plenty of normative values for a lot of these things.
So interesting that it would be nice, back to your comment earlier that some of this research isn't translated. When George asked, how can we, get more of this information? It's not necessarily translated into those of us who are trying to improve our mental and physical functioning. That even to get the Fullerton fitness scales is difficult. You can't just, get to that online. So for those of us who deal with older people and even are older ourselves, to have better access to how do we even measure progress? I mean, how do we know if we're, making a difference? Is it because now I can reach up to the cupboard and get something I couldn't get before, or I can get up off the couch easier, or, it'd be interesting to translate some of this into, really useful measures of progress for those of us who are interested. So I had another question, but maybe anybody else out there? I'm kind of dominating here.
Well, I think even while somebody tries to think a little bit, even just comparing, like if you, a lot of people, don't have access to the norm-based assessments, nor do they have a great way to measure it themselves. I think one important aspect is, of course, comparing to norms is hugely important to kind of get an idea of where you are, but also just comparing longitudinal data from yourself. So I think one of my favorite studies in this area it's a pretty classic, well-cited study. What's the guy's name? Theodorone. I forget where they're from, but it was a paper in JAMA. It was the Journal of the American Medical Association in 1990. They had a group of nursing home residents, and their average age was 87, I believe, or 89. And they put them through what you would think of as a classic resistance exercise training program. And what they saw was 174% gain in strength over the course of the study period. And what it demonstrated to me is that even if people just buy in, even I think their max age in this group was 91, you can see a huge benefit to these things. And given the inter-individual differences, I think even just tracking your own longitudinal data can be super helpful.
There's a wonderful CDC. It's old. I think it's from the early 2000s, but a very nice CDC, maybe 25, 30-page booklet that gives different exercises, pictures, and then a way to kind of keep track over time. Yeah, which is good.
The newest, I don't remember when they came out, but the newest physical activity guidelines for America or Americans, the CDC always publishes things like that, how to assess how hard you're working, how to track over time, how to kind of modulate your exercise to make it harder or easier, considerations to make, how you should balance everything out. So I guess that would be one resource for people that's available for free on the CDC website. You muted yourself.
Yeah. So, what are the three things for the three big takeaways for you, for people as we age? I mean, that graph that you showed at the beginning, it's your 30 and then it's just down, 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 down. For those of us who are, 55 plus even, I guess, what would be the 3 takeaways that you would say, based on all your research, these are the things that are critically important with respect to your research?
So I think I could sum it up in 2. It would be, I guess you could add a third. So sit less, move more, which is kind of it's a national push right now to get people to stop sitting so much and moving more. Eat enough protein, so somewhere in the realm of 1.1 to 1.3 grams per kilo per day, and try to do some sort of muscle strengthening exercise at least twice a week. If you're particularly deficient in that kind of realm, maybe a little bit more. And I would like to make the point that I recommend, my aunt is very familiar with my stubborn mother, but my mother is not as young as she used to be either. And I made her promise to even just start. She was having trouble starting to stand up out of chairs. And so I recommended her to start exercising, and she started complaining about not wanting to find a gym. You can do a lot of this stuff at home. So if you even just have trouble getting out of a chair, like I said, sit to stand out of a chair, slowly you can lower that chair down, start sitting to standing from lower places, and that is an adequate form of muscle strengthening if that's the level you're at. So yeah, eat less, or sit less, move more, eat protein, and do a little bit of getting stronger.
And I have another question around osteoporosis. There are people that I've worked with in the gym who have a diagnosed osteopenia, osteoporosis, and they've been bikers or swimmers. And now all of a sudden it's, oh golly, I got this osteoporosis. It means I really can't twist the same way. I can't, there are things that I can't do anymore. What's really safe in terms of resistance training and strength training for someone with that kind of diagnosis?
So I'm going to give the cop out that I'm not a physician, and that I cannot give medical advice, but what I can speak on, if they are cleared by a physician, one of the interesting things about bone deposition is the idea that you need to, just taking calcium isn't going to do anything. You need to stimulate bone growth at some point. And what we found is the only way to do that is the idea of deformation. So while they don't ideally have any issues, bones to grow actually are signaled by being deformed. So when you hear osteoporosis and the idea of bones becoming brittle, this is kind of what they're worried about, is to make bones grow, they have to deform. And if they're more brittle, they're more likely to have a fracture. So I'm going to shirk your specific question just because I think that's a place for physicians to discuss. But I think you can. There are obviously documented cases of people who safely complete resistance exercise after a diagnosis like that. And arguably, I would think it's an important aspect of the treatment protocol.
Anybody else out there? Yeah, Michael, do you have a question? I wish we could hear you, but we can't. I know, I don't know why. Anybody else out there? Oh yes, Jeremy, go ahead.
Okay, can you hear?
Yep.
I carry with me something that came from my grandma Scott, who lived to be 92 and stayed very active. Keep moving, otherwise you seize up. I will always remember that. So that was her mantra. Keep moving, otherwise you seize up.
Yeah, that's great advice.
Well, that wasn't the only piece of advice, but it was one that stuck with me.
You know, the other issue that I think is so important is, and it's what you said before, that if we aren't able to move and get up from a chair, or, you know, do other things that are in and out of a car, those things that, you know, we take for granted when we're younger, the less we're able to do that, the more discouraging and upsetting it becomes. And then it's just this cycle, you know, where, oh, I can't do this. And then if you have one slight fall, oh, I can't do this, I'll fall. And then it's just a spiral downward. And especially now with this social isolation, you know, there were people willing to come to the gym and do the things that you're talking about. I think it's become a little more difficult when some of us are isolated at home to keep motivated. Any other words that you might share as we finish up on that dilemma?
In perusing the CDC website, I did see that there's a section for how to stay active during COVID-19. Obviously, the priority is staying safe. But even in talking to, again, my lovely aunt, they're doing the best they can to stay active. I think, especially, I spent quite a bit of time on the vineyard when I was a child. The more you can isolate and still get out, go for a walk. If you have some stairs and if you're really comfortable and have somebody around in case something goes wrong, walk up and down the stairs. It's a good form of kind of just using your body as resistance. Doing anything at home is better than nothing, especially given it doesn't really seem like this is going to be letting up in the near future. So I think if you're just kind of riding that train, hoping it goes away, we're burning daylight here, and it's time to get back at it as best you can. No, I mean, it's not an ideal situation, but it's the reality we're given. So
And that's what we're trying to do, keep going as best we can in the circumstances in which we find ourselves, which fortunately on the vineyard, we've got plenty of beaches to walk and trails to hike and